Good morning, Chris. Trying out my new microphone.
That new mic
sounds
good.
I'm very proud of it.
Way less.
It's the most expensive thing I own.
Does that mic cost more than your car?
It does not. No, but I don't own my car, so.
They owns your car. Well, Anthony, good morning. What if everything you thought you knew about hiring was actually making it harder to find the right person? I think it's maybe true for me. In 1892, William Wrigley Jr., I think you probably heard that last name before, started offering chewing gum as premium with each can of baking powder he sold. When the gum became more popular than his actual product, he made the pivot decision. He hired a candy maker as his first employee instead of a salesperson. This unconventional choice led to the creation of Wrigley's empire we know today. The lesson: sometimes the obvious first hire isn't the right one. Today, we have all the way from the mean streets of Erie, Colorado. We're talking about first hires. I'm Chris Franks, Anthony Franco from the mean streets of Colorado, Erie, Colorado. We're having Scott Morris on the show today. He traded his corporate suit for a founder's, I'm going to say it's a puffy vest. Is it a fleece vest or a puffy vest?
It's a puffy vest, man.
Puffy vest, yeah. To launch.
It's a Chandler sweater.
It's PropulsionAI, bringing nearly 20 years of people operations wisdom to the startup world. His mission: turning what used to be painful, creating these job roles. Was it role descriptions? Role description process, turning it into a breeze while helping companies build better teams from day one. Clearly, I need different glasses because I'm having a hard time reading this morning. Scott, welcome. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Guys,
when should I make my first hire as a startup? How should I think about it? What is this thing I should start thinking about when hiring actual other humans?
You know what? I used to, I wanted to be, I think everybody fantasizes about being like the head of a company that's like a large and meaningful company, right? And I had this fantasy of like wanting to have this big 1,000, 2,000 person company. 2,000 people can't agree on anything. I don't want to be that CEO of a company of more than like 10. I think you asked me like, when should people make their first hire, right? Did I hear the question right? And the answer is
when and how. Yeah.
I think the podcast is over because this is like the shortest
Hey,
podcast.
Chris, first time we made our time. We made it.
That's amazing. We stayed under time. That's great. We'd still figure out 35 minutes on just the show closing somehow.
I mean, there are like so many different variables and factors that would color the when decision for founders. But I think how you make your first hire matters hugely. And, culture is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And regrettably, because we use it in such a varied way, it has a lot of different meanings. But culture at its heart is about clarity. And, I think the one thing you have the opportunity to do when you start making hires is build a culture, build clarity around how you're going to hire. And over 25 years that I've been in HR, and 20 of those in a C-level role, I've counseled a lot of managers, and it is really hard once you start to build bad habits to change those into good habits. And I think as a founder, like the greatest thing is all of the habits are new. So when I think about hiring, I think about this, and here's the practical piece. Salary is an investment. And I think a lot of us, when we're hiring, the first thing we think about is, what are all the fires? Like if I said to somebody, why do you want to hire this role? Well, I've got this that needs to get done, and I've got that needs to get done. And I think that's the wrong mental model for any founder to be using. I think the first thing you got to think about is, what do you want to be different in the business?
It's a wildly good point, because Anthony, I think that we as founders hire exactly how Scott is telling us not to, which is we just try to ease the pain in whatever area that we're feeling the most pain in. Like, I hate doing X, or Y is taking me away from the most important job function I have. And this is not a trivial problem, Anthony. 46% of small business failures are attributed to incompetence in hiring and managing people, according to SCORE small business statistics. So, Anthony, talk to me about, first of all, have you made just any terrible hires, like your first hire being terrible or good? Or...
Oh yeah, I've got stories.
By the way, our one bad review, we're pretty sure it's a disgruntled employee.
Yeah, it's probably somebody I hired and shouldn't.
We're just saying that just to save our own egos, Scott. This is like, so give me a good story about a bad hire.
Well, so first, I, on the hiring thing, I've switched. I like this framing of, that Scott positioned it. And I went from like the job interview question. I went from the traditional job interview question that you always ask is, why do you want to work here? And I switched it. I used the same words. I just changed the tone. Why do you want to work here?
A different facets on different parts of it.
It really changes the perspective. I think it's actually the right perspective. It's kind of like I switched my hiring practice to not to qualifying them in. I tried to qualify people out. Like, I tried to warn them what they're about to get themselves into, the chaos and the expectations that they had in the role. And I find my hires got a lot better when I stopped trying to convince people to take the job, rather trying to talk them out of taking the job because of what was expected of them. And the people that leaned into that turned out they were a lot better fit for the organization. So I would say my bad hires were the ones where I had to finagle my culture or talk them into the role. Those are usually the bad hires, because now they're not bought into the system. They're not bought into your organization. You have to buy into them, and it just sets the wrong tone at the gate.
Anthony, one of the things I hear when I hear you say that is you're putting yourself on the same side of the table with the person that you're talking to about the role. And the whole game is transparency. But what are you being transparent about? What you should be working through, the formula you should be working through, is what needs to be different in my business. How do I translate that and articulate that in a certain set of outcomes that I'm going to need that person to produce? Because then you can say, look, here are the things, not here's the tasks you need to do, but here are the outcomes you need to produce. Here's how I'm going to measure success in that, and here are the competencies and skills that I think a person needs in order to perform or to deliver those outcomes well. And once you have that end to end, that is your role design. Now you can sit on the same side of the table and both of you can look and say, are you able to do this? And do you want to do this? And that lets candidates self-select out, and it lets you be hyper specific, or because you are hyper specific, it lets you really start to match individuals to your objective standard, rather than doing what is a horrible hiring practice, which is comparing candidate to candidate.
I think one of the things that we
wait. Back up. Comparing can you dig into that for a little bit? That's a thread we want to pull on, Chris.
He's
Sorry.
not the best color commentator in podcast for nothing, folks.
That was interesting. Not compare candidates. Can talk about that a little bit deeper.
Okay, so let's assume you've got 10 people, right? And if you're comparing candidate to candidate, what you're going to wind up doing is called cream of the crop. You are going to pick the best from the bad that you have in front of you. What if all 10 are bad? The objective standard lets you understand, does a person's past experiences relate to the outcomes that I need them to generate? Do they have competencies and skills that are going to help them to be successful generating the outcomes I need them to generate? I like you more than I like this person is loaded with bias. I'm comparing each of you to an objective standard is a way to get down to who is going to be able to unlock value in my company. And if you start with what needs to be different, you end up with how do I measure that? And in between, you've got the how is that going to be done? And that objective standard, that makes screening easier before you even get a candidate in front of you. It makes sourcing easier to create that original pool, and it lets you be really targeted with your interviews. Plus, let me tell you something else that the objective standard does. It's not just comparing people to it. It's you can divide that objective standard up. The ideal interview practice is when you can take, if you've got a group of people that are interviewing with you, you say group one, you're going to focus on technical skills and knowledge. Group two, you're going to focus on how past behaviors relate to future outcomes that we need. Group three, you're going to look at behaviors and competencies, right? And what that's going to do is, one, it's going to change your candidate experience. Two, it's going to give you a 360-degree look at each of those individuals so that you can say, look, I like this person, but here's why. They are high in this area, they're high in this area, they've got a little bit of development here versus this other candidate, moderate, right? That's what we want. And that's evaluating candidates as a whole, but comparing them to the standard.
God, that's a deep well, and I feel I want to dig in, but I want to ask one other question, then I'll go back to that theme, which is there is a concept I think with founders, and we screw this up so much, which is if we oftentimes need a generalist, and one of the conventional wisdoms is that generalists, people that can do a lot of stuff, are the best people early on. But finding generalists to that standard you just talked about is really hard, because sometimes I don't even really know what needs to be done. I don't know what challenges we're going to face tomorrow. So first of all, should I think about it that way as a founder? Should I think about finding individual gaps and skills, or should I think about I just need to find talented people and plug them in? I've heard this both ways, and I think I've seen it be successful and fail in both of those approaches.
Well, I have to question, how do you know that you need a generalist? Like, what are the factors that lead you to that conclusion? Here's how I think is a better stepping off point, right? Let's say that we're going to hire, we feel like we need to hire an accountant. A totally reasonable thing that most people would write into a job description for an accountant is follow up on delinquent accounts, right? But is that what we need? Like, do we need to watch somebody come in and sit at their desk every day and write a bunch of emails and make a bunch of calls to people who don't want to talk to them? Does that make us feel good for some reason? Is that like really the outcome that we want? And the answer is no. Who cares? It's a means to an end, and it's probably one of many. The real end is what's called days outstanding. That's the number you need to move. It's an efficiency measure for accounting about how fast the organization collects, right? And it has a bottom line impact. So when we're hiring, rather than saying, I need somebody to follow up on those delinquent accounts, the mental model we should be using is, I need this number to move in my business. We need to collect money faster. We need days outstanding to move from X to Y. Now, I'm going to say to that person, your job is to move the days outstanding number. One of the ways you might do that is following up on delinquent accounts. But the ideal situation, once I get somebody in that role, is I want them coming back and saying, hey, if you want me to move this number, shouldn't I be doing these things? And as a boss, I want to slap my head and go, well, duh. Like, I hadn't even thought about that. Of course, you're on the front line. Yes, do those things. The non-negotiable outcome is where that's what I craft. And the way I get there is looking at what needs to be done in the business, not who I need, as a first question.
It drives a great interview question, because you're like, it's something you can ask. How have you in the past reduced the days outstanding?
Yeah.
It's great. Right. Yeah.
Anthony, so I think that's dead right. And I think what Scott's saying is really, really smart. But oftentimes as founders, we're doing everything, and we don't have that moment of being able to take inventory. And so we've talked about it, maybe EOS or some of these other structured processes that allow us to kind of set roles. How do you think about, Anthony, in early on defining the seats that you're sitting in, even if you know you're not going to be able to hire for them in a real, for months or years?
Yeah, if you're looking to replicate yourself, you're going to always be disappointed. So I've made this mistake quite a bit, where it's just, I just need another body that I can just feed projects to, that they're just going to tackle like I would tackle them. That has never worked out. because the person that can do it like me is probably not taking a job. They're probably an entrepreneur, right? I'm not going to be able to hire that person, especially in a startup, especially not as a co-founder. I think Scott really kind of nailed it. He crystallized it in a way that I've never heard before, and that is, what do you need to get done? And if you can't define what the business needs, what is the outcomes that the business needs, then you probably, so it answers the question, when should you hire? It's like, not until you can define what that person's going to do and what outcomes they're going to drive for the business. I think that's kind of the answer.
I think it's a great point. So I'm just going to recap where we've come from, which is start with this idea that hires are investments and that you need to invest in the company. B, clearly define the business needs. And this is, I really love the framework here, because we're asking not what I need as the founders, what does the business need at this moment? And I'm going to invest in the overall growth trajectory of the business. And really, then at that point, you could start to design the person or people that you're looking for based on the needs of the business, not some ethereal or non-concrete approach to hiring people. Scott, I want to ask a question that is sort of central to the way that the conventional hiring wisdom says within early stage companies, which is define your values first, get deep within your values, and then hire and fire based on your values, not necessarily on individual skill set, et cetera. Just react to that. Is that smart? Is that dumb? Is it on the right track but short?
Dude, I'm not qualified to talk about smart or dumb for anyone. Figure it out for myself. But there's a great book, and the author's name is escaping me, but the book is called Culture by Design. And I personally, to answer your question directly, Chris, I think it's a bad idea to try and hire on values. And even though that's sort of conventional logic and wisdom, let me tell you why. Because values are very hard to measure. And you want measurability in everything that you do. So there's an alternative to that, though, and that is to convert nouns into verbs. If the value was being put into action, how would you see it? And those are valued behaviors. Those are worth hiring around. And those are worth defining for the business. But again, you have to think about, like, what are the growth needs of the business? And how does that translate into actions that I want? If I'm the founder, right, I am wholly responsible for creating culture. Short definition of culture, a clear understanding of what is expected. And so if I'm accountable for creating that, then I want to start with, okay, how is the business, what are the levers that move the business forward? And what are the behaviors that are going to have their hands on those levers? And then that is something that we can translate into a hiring process.
Anthony, my favorite, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek, is when a company's core values is you need to be ethical.
You need to have integrity.
Integrity.
Do you know who had integrity as a value? Enron.
Famously Enron. Yeah, Enron. It's one of my favorites.
Right.
It's like saying you need to breathe. We need our candidates to be breathing.
I've actually hired
alive.
based on the mirror
like,
test, Anthony.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you alive? Are you alive? A mirror? Yeah. In which case, that's been one of my hiring criteria.
It is a criteria, but you don't need to write it down, right?
To your point a second ago, I think if you convert values into valued behaviors, you can integrate that same thing into a behavior-based interview process. Think about a time that you had to have candor with a boss in a situation where it was difficult for you to do it. Right? If your valued behavior is we value candor in the workplace, then that's a legitimate question for somebody to ask. But if your value is honesty, like, how do you measure that, right? It's the verb that makes it significant and useful in your hiring process.
Anthony, I want to just address one thing before we move on.
On that, sorry, Chris, I want you to. I'm going to add one thing to that. No, really quick.
Okay, go ahead.
You can candor can also be like, tell me what you think of our website.
That's a
Right?
trap question.
It's not a trap question. Can they
great.
tactfully navigate the fact that your website sucks?
Could they, I guess
Right?
if I hear you right, what you're saying is watching the behavior that you value in action in the interview.
Exactly right.
100%.
Exactly right. How do they navigate that difficult question?
I thought you were.
You think I'm smart or attractive?
I thought you were going with the joke, the classic talent acquisition joke. The recruiter says, "What's your greatest weakness?" The candidate says, "I think I'm too honest."
Yeah.
I don't think honesty is a weakness, and the candidate.
I work too hard. Yeah.
I just spend a little bit too much time in the gym. If you know what I mean.
Sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to interrupt. What was your question?
I don't even remember. I think the main frame that I just wanted you to address is part of the challenges that we have in early hires, Anthony, is this, and it's imposter syndrome. It's this idea that if I can convince somebody to work on my silly idea, I should hire them. And so the interview becomes me as a sales pitch to you, not the other way around. Scott, I want to get you the how, but first of all, Anthony, does that resonate? And if so, how do we first get over that mental barrier before we figure out how to actually hire smart people?
No, it goes back to my initial thought on this, and that is, it's not imposter syndrome. It's like telling the candidate what the expectations are, and warning them that there's going to be a measurement behind those expectations. And if it's kind of like, if you think you can do this, take the job. If you don't take the job, because you won't last here very long. Like it's really just truthful. This is going to be hard. Are you up for the challenge? Right? That's it.
This is the neg approach. Let me tell you about why this job.
The neg approach. Yeah.
Scott. So, all right, if I get over this mental barrier, and this is one thing I know that early stage founders, we mess up all the time because we don't treat these first hires or two as seriously and as disciplined as we should. So talk to me about how I should, as a founder, start to just approach this hiring process. And obviously there's a lot of work that you do now with your company, which is designing the role, but just walk me through the steps that I should go through as a founder.
Well, Propulsion AI makes a tool that is an AI guided, effectively interview of an individual who is looking to build a design for the role. And recruiters, top recruiters, HR business partners, they tell us it's about 4 to 6 hours of effort, sitting down with somebody, helping them get out of their head all of the stuff that they want in that role and that they need in that role. And this business that we've been talking about outcomes and KPIs and OKRs and those kinds of things, right? Then going off and writing a job description, writing a job post, et cetera, 4 to 6 hours. Our platform does it in as little as 15 minutes. But even if you don't use a tool like the one we created, the mindset is what's most important. And so I think you got to, rather than starting to think with the question of like, what pain do I need to get out of? I think the better question is, okay, if I could do everything, what am I not doing right now that needs to get done that's going to make a difference in the business? Okay, then from that, so let's say my answer to that question is, I need to find 25 new customers. Okay, so what are those average customer value? What does that equate to in terms of revenue? And so let's say, for the simplicity of the math, it's $1 million a quarter. And so I need somebody who can move me from where I'm at now to an additional $1 million quarter over quarter in sales. Great. So now, what are the outcomes that are going to produce that? Part of it's brand awareness. Part of it is customer, an increase in customer loyalty or an increase in web traffic, right? But all of those are measurable. So I start with saying, what's missing in the business? That's the first question. And I'm going to translate that into outcomes. What are the legitimate outcomes that will produce that result that I want? And that's the beginning of our role design. Then we start to say, okay, how are we going to measure that, right? Well, look for the pieces that are immediately sort of measurable. And in the example I was trying to build there is, web traffic. Where is it today? Or revenue. Where is it today? And where do I need it to be? And what's reasonable? And you're not going to get those, like the numbers being spot on in the beginning is not the whole, it's not the point. It's the thought process of, look, I'm hiring this person because I need to move this number. And Chris, you made a comment earlier about investment. There's a clarification that I think is massively important. It's not just thinking of it as like I'm investing in this person. If we were investing in a mutual fund, our first question would be about the return, not about the investment. And we don't think about that when it comes to hiring, but that is actually what we should be thinking about. What's the return that my investment is going to produce? I'm going to pay this person X. I'm going to invest in their development. What are they returning to my business? And the only way you know that is you work backwards from what's the result that I need? What are the outcomes that produce it? And how am I going to measure those?
I want to turn, Anthony sent me a note because I was on this same tact as well, which is, so I've defined now this job role, and I've done a good job of interviewing for it because I now have really clearly defined the expectations. I've defined the behaviors that I can witness. I've defined the data that I'm going to use to measure success or failure. So there's a great quote, Anthony, by our arch enemy. This is one bad hire in your first 5 hires will likely kill your company. Peter Thiel said that.
Peter Thiel?
Yeah,
he's not wrong.
He's not wrong, exactly. He's also fairly smart, even though he's.
But it's not the hire's it's not the hire's fault. It's the
right. It's got to be you.
Yeah.
But so I've now done that. Talk to me about the first chunk of time and measuring success or failure, and particularly talk to me about what happens if I get it wrong and I get it wrong early. What are the steps that I should be thinking about in those first 90, even 180 days of somebody's employment?
Chris, is that a question to Anthony or to me?
No, that's to you, Scott.
Okay, so here again, the objective standard comes into play. And this is why we think this is the most important thing that companies do is build the designs, create the designs of these roles. Because it's not just about hiring faster. It's also about really great talent management practices and performance management practices. Right now, I think the weird stat is like 95% of managers hate their performance management systems. And I will tell you, in 25 years, I get asked the same question over and over and over at review time, which is like, what words can I use to make my review go really easily? And whether we're talking about a first 90-day review or a quarterly review or an annual review or whatever, the sad news is there are no words that are going to get you past that review, but there are ways that you can set yourself up for success, and the role design is the cheat code for that. And I'll tell you why. Because if rather than focusing on tasks, if I'm focused on the outcomes, and if I have measurable results, right? Web traffic is here, it needs to be here. Revenue is here, it needs to be here, right? So the first element of my performance review is, here's where the number needs to be. Here's where it started. Here's where it is right now. What's happening? Now, maybe that's a good result. Maybe they hit it. Maybe they didn't. But it opens up a conversation. Like, we said the number needed to be here. It isn't there. What's in your way? Is it me? Is it the company? Is it something else? Now, a bad person is going to give you a BS kind of answer to that. A good person might reveal to you some things that actually need to be pivoted. Either way, it's a good conversation because it reveals something to you. But the only way it's a good conversation is if you're using that objective standard. So in one part of your performance review, and again, I don't think it matters whether it's your first 90 days or quarterly or annually or whatever, the process is the same. The first component is where are you to the results that we agreed you were going to achieve? The second piece is how are you showing up? And that's why we think it's so critically important, whether you call them value behaviors or competencies or whatever, there are behavioral aspects of that. It's not enough to show up and get a result. You have to show up the right way. And in a small company, that makes even more difference, although I think large companies, it matters hugely as well. But, the second component is how are you showing up? We said, these competencies and skills are important. I think you're crushing it on these three. I think you've got some room for improvement here. Let's talk about that. Let's think about ways that I, as the boss, can help you to build and develop that competency. That's a solid performance review. The next is, let's talk about your learning and growth. Like, where are we going from here? How do we start to push your potential? And the last part of what I think a really good performance eval includes is, what do you need from me differently as a boss? How do I need to show up differently? to help you to achieve behaviorally and from a results standpoint what we agreed in the design of this role.
Anthony, the only contrarian opinion that I can really think about here is early in a company, as you start to define what it is that you need, you're probably wrong, because the company and the market and your product and how your solution will shift along the way. I mean, Scott, I'm going to kick it back to you on this, but Anthony, first of all, is that correct? And if so, is that a deal breaker, or is it something where I should be hiring for that kind of lack of structure?
So the answer to this is it depends on the stage of your company, for sure, right? The specific title of this episode is making your first hire, but let's talk about making your first 5. I've talked to a lot of founders that actually have done the things that Scott is talking about, not in a formal way, but just kind of intuitively navigated their way into hiring who they thought was the right person. And they make this mistake now that so you bring somebody in, you think they're going to crush it. Now they're pointing the finger at everybody else for not hitting their numbers or not doing the things that they need to do. You recognize that they're the wrong person for the role. And what happens is we lose our founder mindset, and we go back to the corporate structure that we were in, and we're like, I need to put this guy on a performance review. It's like, no, you don't have time for that. Like you can't, like the waiting for the 90-day review to tell them they're screwing up is too long. If you're early stage, like you don't have the time or the luxury that your competitors have in corporations where they have 1,000 people and one bad hire is going to impact them, 0.1%, where your bad hire is going to impact your company 20%. You got to move on. Say, hey, I made a mistake here. Sorry, it's not working out. You're out, and move somebody else in, and do that as quickly as possible.
Scott, agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. But a couple of additional things, and I shouldn't say but, and a couple of additional things to point out in that. The creation of the objective standard is not the whole thing, right? The role design is critically important, but there's so many other ingredients that go into making a really great hire, including how you're applying that objective standard, that role design in your interview process. And so, you can have a great role design and you can screw up a couple of things in your selection process, and you can still wind up in that situation that Anthony's talking about. It doesn't change the fact that you need the objective standard. And here's what's gotten historically, I think, in the way of a lot of companies is it historically has taken a lot of time to do what I'm suggesting. That's why we created Propulsion AI, because it takes the time variable out of it. And the idea here's what I'm finding as a founder. Most of my assumptions are wrong and everything gets pivoted. And I don't think role design is any different than that. But where it becomes a problem is if it takes a lot of time to do it. And that's where Propulsion AI comes in, because I can quickly pivot that design and do something else. When it comes to talking to that person, Chris, I think you're 100% right. You got to get to them quick, but you got to get to them quick with questions. And the way that you don't eliminate the finger pointing, but you reduce the finger pointing, is you don't make it personal. You're not screwing up. The results are not what we agree. We said the number needed to be here. It started here. It's currently here. What is happening here? The inquiry is the most diffusing thing that gets people out of defense mode and into problem-solving mode. Because before we decide they're not the right person, we need to explore kind of like, what is stopping that number? We both are invested in this. What's keeping you from it? You may get to the conclusion that we just hired wrong. Okay, then we're going to pivot that really quickly. But the way to get there is to figure out to have, what all founders have to do, right? You have a hypothesis. You either prove that or disprove that. You're trying to do it as quickly as you possibly can, and then you act on what you've learned, right? But your hypothesis is still, the number needs to be here, and it's currently here. And what's my hypothesis about why?
It's funny because Anthony was just messaging me that he made a bad hiring decision. He's going to have to move on from me as his co-host, which is, it's hard. It's a hard moment.
I was a little more tactful than that, but yes. Yeah. Sorry, Chris.
Talk to me just so along those lines. the first 90 days, one of the things that I think that we as founders fall into quite a bit is we don't train people or we don't set them up for success because I am so busy that it is actually more painful to bring somebody in because I know I'm adding things to my plate to be able to hand things over. And it's obviously a short-term mentality, but it happens a lot where people are like, I'm not going to actually set that person up, or I'm not going to train that person correctly because it's just more work for me on my plate right now. And I have these 10 things that are on fire. How do you suggest that founders approach it with a appropriate role design? How do I approach these first 90 days, maybe 180 days of a hire?
The whole purpose of the role design is clarity. You think about Daniel Pink's work in the book Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, right? He cited 3 intrinsic factors, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And that autonomy variable is really important, but it only comes because of clarity. This is why it's so important that companies don't make the mistake of assuming that the job description is what you put online. What you put online is a marketing document designed to attract the talent that you want to hire in your organization. That is not your job description. Your job description needs to spell out, here are the outcomes I need, and here are some examples of things that I think you need to do in order to generate that outcome. Here's how I'm going to measure success. This is the amount of weighting, relative weighting that I give. I was working with a management consulting company, one of our early clients in Chicago, and we had one outcome statement, job responsibility, that was about 50% of what they expected. That's an important thing to, I expect you to be spending 3.5 days a week on this aspect of your job, and these other 4 aspects of your job, these other 4 outcomes, the other half of the week collectively, right? That clarity lets people operate with autonomy. Now, you can't get past what are the specific things that they need to know that are totally nuanced that they couldn't have learned someplace else that they have to learn in your company. And that you just like you have to put in the time to create the role design, you've got to put in the time to help them make those moves. But again, the conversation that happens, the number is here and it needs to be here. Why is it not where we think it's going to be? It opens up for that kind of revelation. Well, I don't know these things. I'm unsure about that. Okay, let's fix that, right? When we fix that, does the number change? So it's this constant experimentation that should go on. And I don't know whether I've directly answered the question or not, but creating clarity creates the opportunity for autonomy, and that reduces the burden on you to actually do, a lot of micromanagement that you don't want to do anymore.
So just briefly, how often should I be looking at the job description and performance with this employee in the first year? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? What's your kind of guidance?
If in the ideal sense, every one-on-one is an opportunity to build a part of the performance review. When you deliver your summation of that, whether that is quarterly or whether it's semi-annually or whether it's annually, ideally, you want that to be a summary of the conversations that you've had. And the conversation is a pretty straightforward conversation. Where are you to the numbers? How are you showing up? What are we doing to push your potential? And how do I need to show up differently as a boss, right? And if you take that formula into your weekly one-on-ones and you are note-taking around that, then your performance review gets a whole lot easier to write. And by the way, you're course correcting in either if you're doing it quarterly in 13-week increments or in 52-week increments, if you're a less than best practice provider.
I want to hit one more topic before we move into the speed round. And Anthony, I'm going to cue this up for you, which is oftentimes when we talk about culture and the culture we're trying to build, it's an early stage company. It feels weird for us to create culture statements when it's just one of us. But yet we know that it's so important for us to frame this up. How do you approach that, Anthony, quickly?
I don't try to manufacture culture. You have to be very methodical about who you bring in because in part of that, what Scott was talking about, the the document you build to bring somebody on, you need to make sure they're a culture fit. But turning those values into verbs that's a great way of doing it. Is you have to have the things that you require in employees, like curiosity or creativity or whatever those values are, and then you have to turn that into interview questions. So I don't think you need to create that value statement until you're bringing on somebody else. Otherwise, it's self-affirmation. It's Stuart Small telling me I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and people like
Anthony,
me.
you are.
I am.
We'll just give you just a big virtual hug, Anthony. Scott, react to that. I mean, if I'm a early stage founder, maybe I've got my first hire. Do I need to outline what I want my culture to be when I'm 10, 20, 30? Or is it more what Anthony says, which is the people, my first 5 or 10 hires are going to help create that culture?
Let me tell you, the first place I realized I was completely full of crap as a founder is that I thought, like, I have to have the perfect website. And so I spent time and I was like trying to, like, I really stressed out, like, website, oh my God, this is not right. This is not. I've built 50 websites out of the same company, right? Like, I've changed it 50 times. I don't know how any of this is really any different. Rather than that, I think you got to think about what are the habits that I want to build in my company. I want role design to be a habit. I want weekly, thoughtful, 4 component one-on-one meetings to be a habit in my company. And I'm going to start to build those habits in myself, because as I bring people on, they are going to absorb the founders' habits. They're going to take my habits. So I better have them. So rather than thinking in terms of the outputs, I think in terms of the inputs on that. And I think, what kind of habits are going to drive success.
Scott, we got to have you back. This has been a great conversation and really insightful. So, are you ready to move into the speed round?
There are no sound effects. I'm not doing this podcast.
Yeah, I was thinking about
have sound effects.
Wait. We have here we go.
Oh, yeah. It's your professionalism that I respect.
We've got stuff.
All right.
I think, that's what we're going to need, some sort of like a segment intro to the speed round. And I'm imagining, you remember when Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It's like, da-da-da.
Oh, that's a great
Very
idea.
Dramatic.
I'm
Very
going to
dramatic
find that.
speed round.
I'll find that.
All right, Scott.
I'm ready.
Should I hire remote people or in-person people first?
I would think before that, are you ready to manage them? It gets really hard to manage remote people if you're not doing it by objective. And I think you should question if you think you need to sit, again, back to my example about the accountant, right? What are you trying to do? Like, do you need to see somebody sitting there, sort of struggling with what you're asking them to do? Or do you need to see a movement in the numbers? If you need to see a movement in the numbers, if that's your answer, it doesn't matter whether they're in person or remote. The numbers are the numbers are the numbers. And I think that's why that objective standard is so important.
I like it. Specialist or generalist early on?
It depends. Well, what are the outcomes? This is the genius of role design. What do I need to move? Sometimes they are movements that only a specialist can handle. Fine. Don't make those assumptions up front. Go to what's the result that the business needs? What are the outcomes that are going to produce that result, and how am I going to measure it?
This one we could have an entire episode on experience or potential.
Wow. Hard.
I love the pause. That's such a hard. I'm writing that down as a podcast episode.
Yeah, that's a great one.
That is a whole episode. I don't know. I mean, it's a great question, but it's so context specific. I think we over-index on experience, and I think we way over-index on resumes. And I think potential matters a lot, but potential is harder to measure, especially in an interview process where, if you look at the amount of time you're spending, it's relatively small, right? So I think a blend is my answer, but I think we could riff on that for a while.
I would ask the question: do you have time to train somebody? Because if you don't have time to train somebody, you probably do that. Full time. This is actually another great probably episode. Should I consider contractors, or do I need to think about full time people? Obviously, it depends, but just give me a gut check on that. Are contractors an acceptable
Rent
alternative?
before you buy. Rent before you buy.
I love that. All right, Anthony, great episode. What did you learn?
So the things that I wrote down, the notes I took down, first question you need to ask yourself is, what do you want to be different in the business? Like, why? I'm busy, yes, but what do you want to be different? Using an objective standard, what do I need this person to build, produce, not what are the tasks, or what is this, and then the other thing on that is like when you're interviewing multiple people, it's not comparing it's not comparing candidates to each other, it's comparing them to the objective standard. Having an investment mentality, what is my return on this higher investment? And then the last one I have is let the candidate self-select out. Like, don't, warn them about the job and what the expectations are, and let them say, this isn't for me.
I like the cream of the crap. That was
cream of the crap.
I'm just gonna use that.
That'll be a bullet in the chapter for this episode.
That is pretty terrific.
Cream of the crap.
Deep dive recommendations: The Making of a Manager by Julie Zuho, High Output Management by Andy Grove, one of the all-time classics.
Scott, what were the two books that you mentioned?
Oh gosh,
Drive.
Drive is the book.
Rising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel Pink, and then Culture by Design, and the author's name is escaping me, and I feel bad because I love the book.
We'll find it.
The Culture by Design. And there's a great podcast called Hiring at Early Stage Startups by Y Combinator's Startup School. Scott, where can we find more about you? Where can we find information about your cool AI tool that does designing of not job descriptions, of
role design,
the broader job delivery?
You know what? The greatest thing is that it does. You can find me on LinkedIn. I welcome the connections, and I am, by the way, I'm happy to help. Like, I'm not a consultant, but I am happy to help. If people have questions, bring them to me. I'll do everything I can to give to you. I know what people giving to me has meant as a founder, and I desperately want to pay that forward and help other people. On the web, you can find us at www.getpropulsion.ai, www.getpropulsion.ai. And the tool just makes it easy to do the hard stuff. It's hard for most of us to get this stuff out of our head. Our tool helps you get it out, and then it does all of the writing for you. Performance-based job description for you, SEO optimized job posting, social media content, interviewer guides. It'll do compensation analysis on base salary to make sure that you're equitable in the geography for the responsibilities and the skills that you've built into it. Not 4 to 6 hours, as little as 15 minutes. It's a really interesting tool. Generic LLMs ask you to lead them, and they do a good job of cutting and pasting. Propulsion AI is going to lead you and draw out of you the expertise that's going to create the foundation for great hires and for great talent and performance management.
It just seems like a perfect use case for a custom AI. Like, it just, that's why this stuff exists. Pretty great stuff. Anthony, what do we have coming up?
Coming up, we have a friend of ours, Chris. Have you ever heard of the betting company Sheets and Giggles? He's a fantastic name. He's a great brand expert, Colin McIntosh. But he's going to talk about his superpower, which is getting from 0 to 1. So we're staying in the startup realm this week. So we talked about your first hire. Now we're going to talk about how do you get from 0 to 1 with Colin McIntosh. I'm really looking forward to that. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot today. I really like the way you framed it. We're gonna mention Scott. So we're gonna write a blog post about this. So and Scott will be sure to put a link to propulsion.ai and your LinkedIn on that blog post. To find that blog post and all of our episodes, go to howtofounder.com, and you can follow us you subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Apple Podcasts, and also see our blog posts. As usual, I'll end with, may your venture grow faster than Chris's hair. Thank you, everybody. Bye.